All right, we're live.
Mhm.
All right, bro. So, thank you everyone for tuning in for another episode of the GeoAsh podcast. We're excited to get into some recent events, particularly developments in the Trump administration. We've seen over the past 2 weeks that Trump has been very proactive, very active in making very substantial changes to the status quo. And so, Asher, what's one of the things that has really stood out to you the most, or a few things that have stood out to you the most that Trump has done just within the first few weeks of his presidency?
Well, so I think he came into this administration with some fire under him that he didn't necessarily have in his first term, nor would he have had, in my opinion, in his second term. And that's largely due to the fact that he and his administration, he and his counterparts were just kind of along for the ride in many respects. Um, they were at the whims of the current establishment, and I think we spoke about this on our last podcast, but Trump in that first term, he came in almost under the impression, or prior to being elected, it was like his the chances of him being elected were a long shot. And so once he did actually achieve the seat of the presidency, it was like, wow, I literally have to start from square one because I mean, number one, he had no experience. He and his, much of his close team had no experience in the political realm. And so it was like, where do we start from an executive branch, new beginning? And so, obviously, I think he learned a lot from the first term. And then that second would have been term in 2020. I think he learned the that the root of the establishment is a lot more deep-seated than the people, know about, and surely,
Mm,
those that are new to government would choose to believe. And so, I think the way that he's come in and this in his true second term, so the 20 after the 2024 election, and these literally first 2 or 3 weeks, like you said, of his presidency, it's with this new fire that, hey, if I'm going to get things done and I'm going to follow through on some of the promises or all of the promises that I've made to my constituents in this, in my stint of candidacy, I've got to I got to make radical changes immediately.
mm,
And I think he learned that um, if he does stand still, or if his administration does in some way stand still, the the wheels and cogs of bureaucracy will work against him. Maybe a little bit more slowly, but probably just as effectively as he would be able to, get things done from his own perspective. So, that all being said, I think, that really excites me in that. I mean, I want to believe that our two-party system, for better or for worse, can still achieve change in a large way. And it's not just this front for big corporations to, put in the people pleaser for 4 years and then put in the other people pleaser for 4 years and just kind
mm,
of keep everyone satiated and satisfied. I want to believe that the people still are able to occasionally, and this is not going to always be the case, but to be able to take a candidate at their word and at who they appear to be at face value. And I believe that, Trump is one of those people that you can take them for their word for the most part and for what he says at face value. Just because, in the 2016 administration, I saw many of those promises that he made in his candidacy come true during his presidency, and then the same has been true so far in this second term, like I've said. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, I think that's
It's
kind of where I stand at this point.
Yeah, it certainly does seem that Trump has always, or he's never been the type of person to bluff and not mean what he says. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the biggest initiatives of his presidency this time around is to actually root out the bureaucracy, the deep-seated bureaucracy, which surprisingly a lot of Americans still don't necessarily even believe exists. Or if they do know about it, they think that any attempt to dismantle it is really a threat to our quote democracy or our form of government in general. Like they've sort of conflated the bureaucracy with
Right.
the political system itself, and so that kind of makes me curious to know. Do you think that the initiatives that Trump are pushing this time around that they will make a lasting enough impression on our system that it won't just basically the bureaucracy won't just grow up again within the course of, a few decades. And I know that's not possible to foresee, obviously. Like you can't, none of us have a crystal ball per se. But, history goes in cycles is basically what I'm
Yeah.
getting at. And, even if he does, ultimately succeed at dismantling the bureaucracy and rooting out a lot of the corruption and whatnot, what's to say that it won't within another generation or two spring back up, you know.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I do think about that. Um, I don't necessarily think there's enough that can be done. But I don't want to be completely black-pilled in that arena. I want to believe that, 4 years is still a genuinely long time for a lot of change to happen. And if this rate of change that we're seeing now, like you already think you or I can point to, um, the examples with like USAID and the fact that they've been able to go in there and do audits of USAID's budget and already come across billions of dollars of wasteful spending, bar and spending that errs on the side of corruption even. And so that to me is a very positive sign. If it's which I realize that there are like 400 bureaucratic government organizations that exist federally at the moment, and that's just one of them. But, there's 365 days in a year. And there's what, like 1,400 days in 4 years. So,
Mm.
if that all was the product of, 3 or 4 days of sending a couple kids in from the DOGE, I don't even know what you call it, just that the DOGE administration, um, to do an audit. It's like, what can we find out over the next 1,300 days of discovery? But two, I think to the American people, this new this renewed transparency that is almost an expectation, um, from at least people like myself. It's like I genuinely, as the taxpayer, as the person who feels a sense of duty from his elected officials, um, want to see this continued. I want to see a a renewed pattern of transparency and anti-bureaucracy. And I think so. I think a lot of Americans are sort of feeling that same sentiment that, hey, we're only scratching the surface with some of this stuff, and we're already finding billions. And, billions is a drop in the bucket in regard to, the federal government's spending habits. But still, it's billions of dollars that could theoretically be returned to the taxpayer, and so that excites me. I hope that people don't get lazy. I think that's the biggest thing is we
Mm.
can't as Americans get lazy and not hold our officials to the standard. And I do want to say, just uh, sort of an opinion of mine, is that social media and being able to speak freely on social media platforms is a good thing in that it kind of airs out a lot of the lies whenever you can, speak openly to the world, albeit on a electronic platform, which might not be as powerful or long lasting as, if you were to speak with people in person, but um, it does sort of serve to give a voice to even the smallest of individual, which is kind of cool.
Yes, it allows people on a, in the micro sense to challenge the status quo because I mean like let's face it, the media companies and even a lot of the social media companies themselves, like they have ways to basically monopolize information and determine what gets shown and what gets obscured, you know? And so, yeah, the
Right.
fact that more people are actively participating in challenging, the status quo and making a point to be their own newscaster is, I think, something that's a huge plus.
Yeah.
I also like the point that you mentioned about vigilance, and when you said that, it made me realize something, another interesting question, which is, we've basically identified this problem, and it seems like Trump is wanting to, it seems like so far he is succeeding at doing what he said he would do, or at least he's making progress. I think another question is like we have to ask, how did we get here in the first place? And I think it kind of falls back onto what you said. Like it was a lack of vigilance that allowed this bureaucracy, for example, to become so inundating that it is now oppressive to the average person. The lack of transparency, the corruption, the wasteful spending, which in turn impacts our livelihoods and our welfare. Like all of that is the result of people gradually consenting to, less government transparency, over a long period of time. So it's like, you know, sometimes tyranny manifests itself very abruptly, and then other times it kind of manifests itself gradually and gradually over time. And I think that's probably the most dangerous form of a tyranny is the one that is not quite in our faces, but one day we just wake up and realize like, holy crap, our government is out of control. Like, and
Right.
so,
Yeah, and I think the problem there is that you get to a point where you start to notice the bureaucracy and you start to notice the um, uh, it's like you cross a line. Eventually, bureaucracy crosses a line from servitude into tyranny, and at that point, a constituent would look at it and be like, "Well, what's going on? How did this get to this point?" And I feel like the sentiment would normally be, "Well, we've always done it this way. This has always
mm,
been the case." And
yes,
it's
yes.
because you allow that slow progression of unelectedness and authority. And it's like, well, naturally people aren't going to want to give up their authority. I think that's the problem with bureaucracy is, excuse me, um, these, elected officials create these coalitions or these bureaus or these institutions, um, and those coalitions, bureaus, and institutions, they have to have people to be able to function, right? So then you hire people. Well, the government isn't just naturally going to, the government will always choose to extend its power as opposed to reach a point where it's like, all right, we've pretty much fixed the problem, let's disband.
Mm,
Because I mean, that's the nature of humans. If you have a business, I mean, if you think about people in those positions, if you have a business where it's like, well, our funding, our sales are sort of guaranteed, um, you're just going to continually expand and continue to, elevate yourself, but also, put people under you to inflate your level of power or whatever. And
mm,
I think that's the unfortunate part of bureaucracy that we are seeing is that many of these institutions that DOGE is going into and discovering. just wasteful spending, wasteful and borderline corruption, like I was talking about earlier, is that they have existed since, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and there's been no serious congressional oversight or serious oversight from citizens or the like. So
Mm,
it's just
right.
a bunch of bloat and a bunch of waste.
Bloat's a very good word.
Yep.
But it's I mean another thing is I mean we can't when we talk about vigilance, we can't underestimate the fact that many people who, for over the course of successive generations went along with or consented to a growing bureaucracy which inevitably became wasteful and oppressive. We can't underestimate the fact that these bureaucracies have always been presented under the guise of a positive pretense.
Right.
Like it's always been, well, we need these things because if we don't have them, then something's not going to get accomplished. It's always, that's the way it's always framed. And that's really, it's one of the most classic tricks in the book of how you get somebody to agree with something that's actually screwing them over is,
Right.
you say you try to you market it to them as something that's going to benefit them, but in reality, and maybe it does benefit them, but it's like there's no conversation about, well, do the benefits outweigh the costs? It's like, at what price did these things come? And ultimately, the price has been a more corrupt government, a more inefficient government, um, both with respects to the task it's supposed to perform, as well as, money, the money it wastes. And so it's just like, huh,
Yep.
herein lies the importance of just being educated and being informed and like having a populace of people who are always willing to challenge the status quo and not just accept these very one-dimensional explanations for why something is necessary, you know. But
Right.
that in itself is a challenge. I mean, that in itself is an immense challenge, and yeah, one that every society faces that wants to preserve freedom so for its people because. And like you said, like a government is never apt to relinquish power. It always wants to increase its power. And of course,
Right.
it has a natural incentive to do this because in order to survive, in order to preserve itself, and also in order to govern effectively, it has to be powerful. Like that's the bottom line. Like a government that does not have power cannot enforce law, you know.
Right.
So both domestically and internationally. And so it's a it's not a problem that's rooted in any particular government or form of government or people. It's a timeless problem. It's embedded in human nature. Like so, yeah.
Absolutely. Um, so really quickly to go kind of touch a little bit more on um, U.S. aid and some of the spending that was uh, recently discovered by the DOGE. Um, I just want to point out a few things, and this article is from factcheck.org. So whether it's reputable or not, I don't really know, but I would assume it looks like, most of their stuff is cited. So a few things that they spent money on. $1.5 million was spent on DEI programs in Serbia's workplaces. $70,000 was spent on the production of a DEI musical in Ireland. $47,000 was spent on a transgender opera in Colombia. And then $32,000 was spent on a transgender comic book in Peru. And so what that tells me is that um, these organizations, so, USAID, and granted, that wasn't more than, $2 million worth of spending, but um, Congress each year, approves a certain amount of money for spending in each of these various institutions, bureaus, and the like administrations. Um, and so, they foot these millions and billions of dollars to these administrations, And it's the job of the people that exist within, these agencies to figure out what to do with all this money,
Use
right?
discretion, yeah.
Right. Use discretion. And so I think that is clearly a problem if what we're choosing to spend our money on is because the whole premise of USAID is that it's, aid and development for, um, like third world nations. Well, how is teaching, how is the development of a transgender comic book or the production of a DEI play in Ireland, which first of all is not a developing nation, but those other nations, how is that trying to elevate those countries to a level that I don't know, like
How
what
does
about
it,
that is
yeah, how does it
productive?
improve? Yeah, how does it improve their standard of living?
Right.
It's like, how does it
And
improve the state of their economy? Yeah.
right. Um, I saw this quote yesterday, and it was like, or this lady was complaining on X, and I did agree with her complaint, which was, I'm tired, or when did we decide that the American taxpayer would be the world's B word? And I was like, honestly, that is really like it was undecided that we would foot the world's bill on development and security and you know a slew of other things. But that's genuinely the position that the American taxpayer finds themselves in. And you can make the argument, and this is definitely true, that regardless of all of this wasteful spending, all of the um, money that we just throw out into the world and just constantly, right? I mean, the United States, we are by and large, by far the most charitable country on this earth, right? We do so much more privately and publicly than any other nation on earth. And we still have it really good for the most part. Like generally, the average citizen, I'm sure, has it far better than the average citizen of the rest of the world. Um, so like you can make that argument, but it doesn't make it any fair for us, for you and I who had no choice to be born and be conscious in this nation, um, to have to foot the bill for the rest of the world.
Yeah, man. Yeah, fundamentally, like they're like you said, nobody voted for this. Like
Yeah.
Americans did not vote for that. And another myth, which I would like to dispel, is that the government pays for anything. The government pays for nothing. It's
Right.
ultimately taxpayers that fund the government. Ultimately, like that's ultimately the way the government raises revenue is through taxes and printing money, which inevitably, like we all use. And so like we're the ones who suffer, for any financially for, the government's fiscal irresponsibility. Now,
Right.
the things you mentioned about what these US aid funds have went towards in foreign countries, it just indicates to me that the the intention is very deliberate. It's pushing a cultural agenda as opposed to an economic agenda. And arguably you could say that the ability to influence culture is more important than or at least it's more powerful than the ability to influence economics. Because the thing is like, if we look in the United States, one of the cultural trends which are features of our contemporary culture is that men are less masculine, women are more masculine. There's this epidemic of people who are identifying as the opposite sex, and there's just a lot of confusion and mental health issues and disorders. And this is the way that you systematically weaken a people, is you indoctrinate them with a culture that makes them dysfunctional, and it keeps them in a position where they are not able to think critically, they're not able to think soundly, they have a warped view of reality. And it's a mental or intellectual form of subjugation. And so Yeah, to me, I mean, when I see stuff like that, I think that, there's a lot of people who obviously support, transgenderism and all that, those agendas. And they think that the fact that the United States would fund any of those causes overseas in these underdeveloped countries would be a good thing. Um,
Right.
but ultimately, man, like the bottom line is that citizens don't vote on this stuff. Like, and this is where democracy breaks down is you have bureaucrats who are supposed to use their discretion, bureaucrats who weren't even elected, but are supposed to use their discretion to spend our money. It's like, why am I paying taxes if it's not going towards improving my community, if it's not actually benefiting me as a citizen, you know? And
Yep.
that's the thing, man. It's like being a citizen doesn't just mean, inheriting rights, certain rights and privileges. It's, no, we contribute to this. We work our entire lives paying taxes so that we can reap some benefit out of what we've paid in. Like that's Social Security in a nutshell. But, we've gotten to a situation now to where our government has been so fiscally irresponsible that Social Security is on the cusp of being dismantled. And so it's like,
Yep.
hey, Mackenzie.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Um, yep. So I would ask you, what is your, do you have any sort of experience with bureaucracy on a personal level
The DMV.
besides the DMV? Some situation or, experience that you can point to where it's like, I was a direct victim. Maybe that's the wrong word, but, I was directly affected by bureaucracy in that it got in the way of, what would have otherwise been or should have been a straightforward, interaction with the government, or in many other cases would have been, easily solvable or something like that. Because what I would tend to think about is like, um, and this may be a silly example, but like additions to a home. You ever heard of like, so you have to, dependent on your HOA, dependent on, you know, what your city code is, dependent on
Hmm.
where you live, you have to you have to subscribe to specific standards of development. And that's true for any time you would want to make a change to um, like your fence or to the size of your lot or anything. So I'll give a quick example, which is this is kind of like not in total relation to um, federal bureaucracy, but it still pertains in that local bureaucracy is just as much of an issue. So my dad, um, he wanted to rebuild a section of fence that faced the main road that ran or runs right next to where our house is in Arkansas. And so he's like getting estimates. He gets a city inspector to come out, just to make sure like property lines and everything line up. Well, come to find out, the fence that was installed by probably the previous owner, um, was 5 feet, or it might have even been like 10 feet too far towards the road. Like there needed to be from the center line of the road, like 30 feet between the center line of the road to your fence. Well, anyways, it was like 20. And so if he had adhered to the city code, he would have had to have taken the fence in by 10 feet, which would have obstructed a rock wall that we had in our backyard and that had been there for probably 15 years. And so it's like it almost it blows your mind because it's like, well, clearly the previous owner bypassed that city law, or it didn't exist until um after they had already made that change and it was sort of just grandfathered in. And now my dad is trying to make, one simple change, rebuild an existing fence.
Mm.
Yet he is supposed to take it in by 10 feet and change the entire layout of our backyard. Just because, a city official came out and discovered that, hey, oh, you're clearly out of code here. Well,
Mm.
I guess to wrap that story up, he has the city official out again. He's like, "Hey, I'd really like to just, rebuild this fence, but if I truly can't build it where it is, I'm probably just going to go to the city officials or like the city board and plead my case." And the
Mm.
guy was like, "Just just rebuild it where it is." And so it's like,
Yeah,
and
look,
so it's
exactly, dude, because at the end of the day, it doesn't present a real problem. Like that's the
exactly.
bottom line. And
Yep.
that's a problem with bureaucracy, man, is like they just put a sweeping one size fits all approach to
Right.
rules and regulations to the point to where it's like, man, something as simple as rebuilding a fence becomes a whole like ordeal. Like that's insane.
Exactly.
It's insane.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the caveat here is, as a society becomes more complex, it's almost like without that bureaucracy, there is no or there's far less regularity and order. Like it's in a sense, the bureaucracy is necessary because you have to have some structure and some rules, but for people who simply want to do something, to their fence, for example, like in this example, that's a perfect example of how it becomes more redundant than anything. So,
Right.
wow. I don't really have any such example aside from like little things because I've never really owned a house.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, generally speaking, the government or any public agency drags their feet on a lot of things. Generally, there's exceptions to that, but like dealing with them to get anything done, it's not uncommon to encounter people who are unprofessional, who don't really care about their job. They're just there to collect a paycheck. They're administering some service, and it's just, yeah, it sucks. It
Yep.
sucks. So the I wish that, like, as a culture and as a countryman, we could get back to a way of life in which people are literally just free to do whatever they want so long as they don't harm others. You know? It seems like such a simple maxim. It's like, okay, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anybody else. You know?
Right.
It's like,
But I do understand. So, the point of bureaucracy in that we should maintain beauty. I don't think that's something that naturally comes to a lot of people, or is many people's standard at all. I'm gonna maintain a clean residence. I'm gonna maintain a uniform residence, which it's like. I care about that to an extent, but I also want people to have the freedom to freaking have a trampoline in their front yard, you know?
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I also, want I don't know, there's something about that. It's like what's the extent to which we should require beauty or cleanliness, and what's the extent we should, allow people to do what they want.
Well, yeah, in a given neighborhood or, community, I think like people should be required, like if they join that community, they should be required to consent to the guidelines and the
Maybe
standards in that community, you
right.
know? And like if you want to live out in the country where you can have like 20 dogs and, 20, 30 cars in your in your front yard, it's like if you want to do that, then go somewhere else. But like, yeah, I think
You
like
can't do that
at
here.
the end of the day, we should have a society as well as communities that operate off of consent more than anything. It should always be about, okay, like people are free to do what they want to do, but when people want to have any sort of collective action on anything, then it needs to be about consent. And so, man, democracy really works best at a small scale because it's like it's an organic thing. it's such an organic process to just have people in an environment where they feel like they're of an equal status with others in terms of their will and their intentions, and to feel like they actually have an impact on whatever is being discussed, whatever is going to be accepted or rejected. And so anyway, I say that to say that like our society, man, like it's grown and become so big and so complex that like many people just feel powerless. They feel like they don't have any autonomy and independence and freedom and ability to really affect change. They feel like, man, I'm just another number in this vast sea of other people who are basically trying to make the best out of circumstances that are handed down to us. And it would be really nice to see us get back to just more authentic, organic, small scale community way of life, community centric way of life. Because I'm like another thing, man, another trend, which I began to think about recently, like historically, with the Industrial Revolution, it encouraged urbanization. Like people moved from the countryside into the cities. They concentrated into cities because like there's more opportunity for work, better standard of living, um, higher wages and stuff like that. And the same still holds true today. And so you have situations where like people will leave their roots, they'll leave their family, their community, in order to pursue some like economic opportunity. And so
Yep.
it's just a trade-off made on a societal scale. And it's no wonder why we've gotten to this very impersonal way of living life and being in society, being a part of society. Like this way of life is very impersonal, and it makes people feel like a blob as opposed to a part of something, a part of a true community. It's just an imitation of community.
Yep.
So sorry, my Zoom it like failed for a second, but yeah, that's all
Oh
I
yeah.
had.
Yeah, I'd say much of the time people trade convenience for community, especially when it comes to existing in a large city or even a medium-sized city, even smaller cities. Sometimes we will trade. Not to say that the rural lifestyle is you know, perfect in any way, but really it's more about being oriented. So like you, for example, you were able to leave your community in large part. Granted, you do know some people in Indiana, but uh, you left sort of the community that you knew for convenience and opportunity. Maybe not convenience. It might not be convenient to live
Well,
out where you
definitely
are, but
opportunity. Like
definitely
definitely
opportunity.
opportunity. Yes.
Right. Um, so it is an interesting trade-off, but it's like that's just kind of what humans do is we like obviously economic opportunity is enticing in a really good way normally. Um, but it's almost like community is what we strive to create through that economic opportunity or to at least be able to get back to.
It's what we're
Um,
made for, man. Like at on a genetic level, man, it's like what we're made for is to be a part of a community,
yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
And like if you look at like pre-modern, which not to like romanticize pre-modern way of life or primitive way of life because it was hard. Like it was undoubtedly
Yeah.
hard. But like there were a lot of people and peoples that were content with, like pursuing economic opportunity alongside their community. Like, uh, even people in a feudal society, like a feudalistic society. One of the things that I've learned recently is that feudalism wasn't like at least in medieval Europe was not quite as bad as it's often portrayed. Um, because honestly, man, when you think about it, it's very similar to our way of life. Like the peasant farmer or serf had the benefits of security and stability as so long as he was loyal to his feudal lord, you know. And he also had the added benefit of being able to have a small scale community like with his family. Now, obviously, like there was a hierarchy of power. Like he wasn't a citizen, he didn't have the rights of a citizen. But if he was fortunate enough to have a feudal lord who was benevolent and humane, he actually didn't have it that bad, you know. So he kind of gets the best of both worlds, where he has economic security on the one hand, and he gets to have that organic family community on the other hand. And so,
Yeah, it's interesting.
I feel like the way that we should think about it, man, or the way like the ideal is how do you harmonize economic opportunities with small scale community? Because at the end of the day, it's like we're only meant as individuals, we're only meant or we're only really designed to be in so many people's lives or be actively involved in so many people's lives, maybe a couple hundred, maybe a few thousand max, you know, as an individual. That's about as far as our reach is concerned. And then in excess of that, like the only other reach we have is through like the digital world, which is again,
Right.
it's impersonal. It's like somebody that you interact with via computer screen that you'd never met is just that's just that. It's like, yes, that is another person, but it's like it's not the same as your brother and your sister and your friend and your coworker, your wife. It's like not the same thing. And so,
Yep. Yeah, our interconnectedness has superseded what we as humans are able to um, exist, maybe not within, but are able to deal with from a, community. If you're going to be community oriented, you only, like you were saying, have so much capacity to deal with hundreds of people, max, maybe 1,000 people.
hmm,
Um, Whereas we live in this interconnected world where at the tip of our fingertips, which is such a cliche, are this 8 billion people that exist on this planet. Um, and I think we did touch on that a while ago whenever we talked about how um, that because of that, because we literally have 8 billion souls at the tips of our fingertips, it gives us this like feeling of power in that, I can immediately project my what I think is right for the world upon all of these people because, my voice can be heard by 8 billion people at once, in theory. So, but I do agree. I think that the key to, um, harmonious living or the best way of life is to be community oriented first. And I would argue that the best way to do that is through um, either a church or some other organization where, you are surrounded by like-minded individuals and their families, young and old, um, in a interpersonal way.
hmm. Amen, brother. I agree with that 100%. The problem The problem with some contemporary communities is that they are basically cesspools. Like I think about universities. Like there are a lot of young people who, you know, instead of going to church, like they are super actively involved in like a campus setting, you know,
Right.
which is not a bad thing. Inherently is not a bad thing, but when you have campus settings throughout the country which are cesspools for indoctrination as opposed to education, and they're breeding people who are mentally unhealthy and unstable, it's just like this is not like healthy community. Like it is community, but it's not healthy community. And so
Yep.
like that's not, you know, if anything, that's worse. Like it's you might as well be isolated from that as opposed to be involved in that. Like if that's your only option. So,
Right.
but man, just to pivot, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this because there's a lot of people in this country who like they have good intentions. They think that they have the correct position or standpoint, but they are obviously like opposed to Trump and they're opposed to what he's doing, and they have more or less been sort of I hate to say brainwashed because it always feels like an exaggeration. Maybe they have been brainwashed, some of them, but they've at the very least they've been influenced to think of him a negative in a negative way. And I think at the end of the day, like every American should want their president to be successful, regardless of whether, they agree with him or not. But there's some people who are making extreme characterizations of Trump and what he's doing, and they're calling him a dictator. And I wanted I wanted to know like your thoughts on this. Like, do you think that there's any merit to this point of view, or do you think, or and if there isn't, then how would we persuade someone who has this point of view to see differently?
So Trump is a dictator. Um,
Well, not a dictator, but
well,
it's
that's what
maybe.
people go
Well,
ahead.
there are some people. Well, I think that's obviously an extreme position. I would say like bringing it a little back on the spectrum. How about the people who think that he has dictator tendencies? They're not saying he's a dictator, but has dictator tendencies.
I think a lot of it has to do with, I think a lot of that sentiment has to do with um, just what is reinforced through media and these echo chambers of anti-Trump sentiment. Um, because I don't think there are really any examples of his presidency or his personal life or his business life that you can point to that exemplify dictatorial action or policy. Um, I think that in some ways, like it's easy to characterize a man of such character. That's kind of redundant, but it's true. Characterize a man of such character in ways that make him look and seem like a dictator. Um, you know, like you can make comparisons of like intensity in like dictators of the past to Trump in the present day and see that all right, he's got some personable characteristics that might be similar with some dictators of the past, or he's got this um, that same charisma, right? That
Hmm.
and I don't know if that's necessarily true for every single dictator that's existed, but it's like it's almost a strength. It's a strength that you can wield in a dictatorial way or in a way that is for the people and is freedom oriented, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Hmm.
And so, I think that is probably the only thing that I could point to where I would see some reason in the minds of those that believe that he is a dictator or has dictatorial tendencies. Otherwise, I think, there's not, like I said, a single example that you can point to where, he's done something
Hmm.
in either of those realms. Um, I think and this kind of goes back to, the bureaucracy and the stagnation of our government is that he is genuinely getting things done and like there are consequences to his actions in that like I've been saying these past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, he has signed the executive orders. He's created um, these new branches of his administration that have gone in and carried out on some campaign promises. And so it's almost like for many people, especially on the other end of the aisle, it's like, whoa, he's making a lot of big changes to what we got comfortable with, to what we've always done, right? It's back to the bureaucratic nature of government. Um, that feels like kind of like you were saying a disservice to our democracy.
Hmm.
And I would say, and I think, the majority of Americans would say that that's a very, very good thing, in that we are changing up from the status quo because we're dissatisfied with the current state of America, and that's why we chose the president that we chose. Um, but yeah, I mean, can you think of any examples where, he's been a dictator or that there's reason in calling him like a dictator or
The
having
thing
dictator tendencies?
In my opinion, when I look at Trump's style of statesmanship, he is unlike any president in recent history. Like, when was the last time we saw a president who like held numerous press briefings after signing multiple executive orders like this frequently? Within such a short span of time after assuming the presidency. It's like
Hmm.
it's his style of statesmanship is distinguished primarily by his initiative. Doesn't
That's good.
he doesn't wait around, or he doesn't seem to want to wait around for anybody to like Congress, for example, to get around to doing something. He's just defying the expectations in the status quo, and he's doing it on the grounds that it is obviously like to America's benefit. I truly do think that his intention is to govern for the benefit of America. The only thing that alarms me about him is his posturing of territorial expansion. Like we've talked about, with the Panama Canal, Greenland, and most recently the Gaza Strip, which all those things could be positive things um, globally. Like they could have positive net benefits. Again, no one has a crystal ball to like predict or foresee that, but the biggest thing for me is like as Americans, our Declaration of Independence, like our philosophy, the philosophy upon which our nation was founded is predicated on this belief that people have the right to govern themselves, like they are self-sovereign, and that, it's not supposed to be in the hands of any statesman or ruler or government to neglect, or well, not neglect, or but to infringe the sovereignty of others. And so, that's to me, that's a it seems hypocritical for us if we for example, like if we support invading some sovereign territory, like that seems very hypocritical. Not to mention, I think the emphasis should be on domestic issues. I think at the end of the day, like everybody wants to see America thrive. And if the path to seeing America thrive is seeing other people's, around the world or people here, seeing them be treated like means to an end, then or means to that end, I think that is that's just not the way to go, But that's really like the only thing, in my opinion, that I could see somebody interpreting like his tendencies as dictatorial. But um, but all in all, man, I think that ultimately, like he is definitely one of a kind in terms of, the history of presidents, or at least modern presidents. Like I can't think of any president who has been so just out of the gate, just so active and so hands-on with it. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's my take on that.
Yeah, I would say too that he's a mover and a shaker in a lot of the right ways. I would say even in your example to defend just to defend his recent geopolitical moves um is that in my mind, and maybe this is not true, maybe this is what we'll see take place over the course of his presidency. Um, things like the annexation of Greenland and the annexation of the Panama Canal, and now, like you were saying, he's talking about potentially moving into the Gaza Strip and making that. I don't know if his plan is to potentially make that a U.S. territory or to just revitalize it through, moving some of the Palestinians around. And because I think at the end of the day, I mean, that's a extremely complicated situation to begin with. You've got 3 million people within, um, or it might even be more than that. It's a lot of people within the Gaza Strip, and it's like no bigger than Manhattan or Long Island or something. It's tiny. But anyways, it's a complicated situation to begin with, and I think what Trump understands about that is that there is not going like a two-state solution isn't a solution. It never will be, never was. So a power like the United States coming in and hopefully transforming that region would not or would allow for um, peace, at least in the Gaza Strip, and maybe some stability from an external government. Now, whether that'll work, I don't, who knows? It hasn't been successful in the past, and I would err on the side of, let's focus domestically, but I don't think he's not going to do that. I don't think it's a one or the other. I think it's, you know, Trump using the resources of the United States for geopolitical gain at large. Um, but kind of like I spoke about last time, I think he is in a position right now where the United States, we are not, where we once were, like, after, like in the mid 20th century or even in the early 21st century, where we were heralded as this world power, and, a country not to be messed with, especially because China and Russia at that point weren't, um, the powers that they are today.
Well,
Um,
yeah, certainly not China. Yeah.
right. And so I think some of these plays from a geopolitical perspective are like, the United States is back. The United States is I'm gonna be a mover and a shaker, and I'm going to shake the standard, just like I was talking about in terms of bureaucracy. I'm gonna shake up the status quo in terms of what's expected from a world superpower, or what's expected from the United States citizen, right? That we're gonna continue to be the world's bit. Um, so yeah, I think I don't necessarily. I don't ever think it would come to like rapid expansion, like, if it were like we were invading and killing people, now that would be a different story, right? Obviously. But if it's a population truly wants, to be a part of the United States, or the Panama Canal, was given up on unfair terms, and the contract that we set in place upon the supposed sale of the Panama Canal isn't being adhered to by, Panama or the surrounding countries, and it therefore should be our right to void that contract. Things like that I can totally understand. I think he's done with, as am I, the United States being taken advantage of, which is a proxy for the United States citizens being taken advantage of.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. We as a nation, we definitely don't need to be screwed because um we're not willing to enforce like agreements that we've made with others. Nor should we be screwed because we've overcommitted ourselves
Yeah.
to things that are just exhaust us financially and also with respect to like resources. And I think most notably about like our military. Like I think one of the most tragic things is, one of the most tragic scenarios would be for us to start yet another war, another pointless war, and that results in the needless loss of, young men, and young men who could be in this country raising the next generation of strong young men. It's like that is a cost that we often fail to account for whenever we talk about like the history of um, warfare in the United States, military history in the United States. Like the United States has been involved in some military conflict for the majority of its history. Like
Yeah.
we have had to be that. I mean that it just speaks to the cost of being a number one world superpower. Is like in order to maintain your position as that. But to maintain this status as number one world superpower, like you got to have the guns and you got to be willing to use the guns. The problem is like it's very similar to the bureaucrat problem. The spending problem is who's using that discretion. Who has the discretion on how those guns get used. And you know, if you mess around there and decide to wage a war on false pretenses, talking about like, oh yeah, we're defending democracy and all this stuff, like, you know, in Ukraine, for example, like between Ukraine and Russia, it's a perfect example. It's like we're sitting here needlessly wasting resources, um, just committing more and more actions that are only destabilizing the world and hurting Americans here at home. It's like, well, what are we doing? It's like, what are we doing?
Right.
Like, I didn't vote to send billions of dollars to Ukraine. I didn't vote for that. And so
Yep.
yet it affects me. And so, and you, affects all of us. So,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think our involvement globally is at a point where we historically have played the geopolitical game in favor of our supposed interests abroad. And I think, a lot of that comes back to um you follow the money trail, right? You follow, okay, why is it necessary that we fight these proxy wars? Why, like, the government, it's crazy. You look at, like, just the last 30, 40, 50 years, the number of state-sponsored coups around the world, via, the CIA or the FBI,
yeah.
have, it's like an innumerable number.
Yeah.
Um, or at least it's in the high
That's
hundreds, probably.
that's part of what contributed. It's not the only thing, but it's part of what contributed to the immigration crisis that we're fighting at the southern border. Is like
Right,
the CIA in the 20th century engaged in many coups and basically destabilized a lot of Central American countries, and that's contributed to the circumstances of today. You know, it's very unfortunate. It's like
right.
so.
Yeah, and I know that some of that, and I would have to look at the history, and it's actually an extremely interesting history, our involvement in South America and Central America in the mid 20th century. And the regimes that we supported or supposedly supported, and then we would uh, fund the next overthrow and then the next overthrow because we weren't satisfied, or who knows what it was really. It's like
It's just like
who's we in the situation, who wasn't satisfied. And I think the constant that we'll probably find over the next 50, 100 years, when we investigate all of the happenings, all of the horrible things that have been state sponsored, is that it was all in some way power related or money related.
that's yeah.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
and generally that's what things come down to anyways. But um, yeah, it's funny because you as an American citizen, this is why I choose not to get blackpilled about that sort of thing, is as an American citizen, you can choose to conflate those actions with the idea of America, right? Like the idea that a a people governed by um, you know, inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness,
Mm.
and the ability to create a government, but also to um, choose, who is in the government. I choose to disassociate that great idea and just the idea of the American democratic republic with a lot of the bureaucratic, largely atrocities that have taken place over the centuries. Almost what are we at? Nearly 250? It's 250 years here in what? Next year?
I think so. Yeah.
1776. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, almost 250 years of existence.
Which is
Um,
not a long time in the grand scheme of things. For a country, it's not a long time.
no, not at all.
We're still very young.
Extremely. Yep. But yeah, so I choose not to conflate the two things, um, because I know that, and that's my problem with so many people that are, maybe not problem, but that's my that's the thing I wish more people that are apt to disown the government or disown America in that, I would almost ask them, like, so what's your solution barring, because it's easy to separate, the idea of America and what we should adhere to with, what we've sort of allowed it to become. And I think that's another good, um, I think that's one of Trump's ideas is that no, inherently we're still a good nation. We still have great principles to to allow ourselves to be governed by. We just have let a lot of stuff get in the way, and that's kind of
Mm.
why we're suffering at the
And
moment.
and fundamentally, we're just divided on so many issues that should be non-negotiables in the first place. You
Right.
know, like when you have one half of the population and another half of the population who can't seem to agree on what a man or a woman is, it's like
Yeah.
it's like, well, what do you expect the society to reflect? It's like, it's like, man, you can't no house divided can stand. Here
Right.
it goes back to what Christ said. House divided against us or kingdom divided can't stand. One of those.
Yeah.
So
Right.
so it's man, ultimately, man, like it's the people. I wish that people would remember, like realize that, as far as like people who are in power, people who are decision makers and stuff like that, they're always going to do what they do. History shows that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so like you give man the power and he's going to find a way to F things up. But people who are vigilant, it always falls back to the people to be vigilant enough to guard and defend against transgressions against themselves. It's like this, man. Like if you let somebody push you around and bully you and walk all over you, they're going to. They're going
Yep.
to. Like absolutely 10 times out of 10, they're going to if you let them. But
Yep.
if you wake up one day and you say I've had enough, like enough is enough, and you decide to make them hurt, not out of vengeance or spite um or hate. It's no, 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 no. It's like, look, there are certain non-negotiables. There's lines you do not cross. And, we got to remember that, man, a right is called a right for a reason because you are entitled to it, not as a, not so much as a citizen, but as a creation of God, because that's the whole basis of our form of government, man. It's like, whether we call it God, nature, or providence, there's something higher than government that has endowed us with our rights, you know? And the day we decide collectively that no, it isn't God or nature or providence, but instead it's the government that can discriminately dispense of our rights at will, um, I mean, that's the day that we lose our identity as a nation. And in some ways, I think that explains like how we've become so divided is just because like, it's a classic problem of, the example that people use of generational wealth. Like
Yep.
it only takes like two or three generations for generational wealth to dissipate,
Yep.
It's the same thing with our cultural, intellectual, and religious wealth, our heritage. In that respect, it's like after a few generations, people become entitled. They begin to take certain things for granted, and they stop being vigilant in defending the rights or fighting for the rights that they were blessed with by no merit of their own. It's like I didn't earn the benefits and privileges of, that accompany life in this country. I don't know about you, but I didn't. I was just born
Right.
here and very fortunate and very grateful to have been born here. But make no mistake, like the price of freedom is very high, you know? And so that's my
Yeah. No,
spiel.
yeah, you're right. And it's almost it is exactly that we have sustained the privilege and um you know the American ideal is that the generations before us, the generations that preceded us, were did choose to. believe that, my rights aren't given to me by the government, or my ability to prop myself up isn't lost in my suffering. Um, there's always like they didn't lose that, and therefore we shouldn't lose that same sentiment. I know I've used that word a lot, but that's true.
Sentiment is a good word.
Sentiment. Yeah. Um, but no, you're exactly right.
Hmm. Well, my friend, this has been a very productive conversation, and I thank you for taking the time to have it with me. I see that we
Absolutely.
have only about 3 minutes left,
Yeah,
and so I figured this might be a good good ending point for us.
sounds good. And I'm thinking next time I want to touch on with you, and this can be a little preview for our next podcast for you guys that are listening. Um, touch on our rights. What rights are inalienable? What rights do some people expect that we are born with whenever we might not be? And you know that because that's a conversation that is relevant for today,
Ex
especially.
Extremely relevant, man. Extremely relevant, and I'm super excited to get into that conversation with you because it's definitely one that's been burning hot on my mind for a long time. So
Cool.
yeah, we will next time everybody look forward to that. And in the meantime, be blessed, fight for your freedom. And yeah,
And
God bless.
expect good things from your government, and don't hold your government accountable. Don't be passive
Right. Absolutely. Yeah,
because they work
absolutely.
for you.
Challenge the status quo.
Yes.
Okay. All right, my friend. Thank you again for your time. Much
Thank you.
love.
Much love, Gio.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.